Hello, English learners. Welcome back to English Practice with Julia. I'm Julia, your host for today. And if you're new here, I'm really glad you decided to join us. On this channel, we share English learning lessons regularly to help you build confidence, develop fluency, and move closer to advanced, natural communication, step by step. In today's episode, while we're going to focus on something extremely important for high-level learners, something that truly separates intermediate speakers from advanced ones. We're diving into how to improve your English listening at the C1 and C2 level through deep, focused conversational practice. This is not just about understanding words. It's about understanding nuance, tone, implied meaning, cultural references, rhythm, and real conversational flow. Throughout this lesson, you won't just passively listen. You'll actively train your ear. We'll explore realistic daily life conversations, subtle expressions, advanced vocabulary and context, and the kind of natural phrasing that native speakers use without even thinking about it. I'll also guide you through reflective listening exercises, shadowing moments, and comprehension challenges designed specifically for advanced learners. At the C1 and C2 level, listening becomes less about catching vocabulary and more about decoding intention, attitude, emotion, and unstated meaning. You'll learn how to follow complex arguments, recognize sarcasm, interpret hesitation, and understand layered responses in real conversations. By the end of this session, your listening will feel sharper, more intuitive, more confident. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and turn on notifications if you'd like more advanced English practice sessions like this one. Now, take a slow breath, relax your shoulders, clear your mind, and prepare to truly listen, not just to the words, but to the meaning behind them. Let's begin. When you reach an advanced level in English, listening changes in a very subtle but powerful way. At lower levels, you focus on understanding vocabulary, grammar, and basic sentence structure. But at the C1 and C2 level, the challenge is completely different. Now, the real question is not what did they say, but what did they really mean? And that small shift makes a huge difference. Advanced listening is about layers. It's about hearing the words, understanding the structure, and at the same time, noticing tone, pauses, hesitation, emphasis, and even what is not being said directly. Because in real life, people rarely speak in perfectly structured textbook sentences. They interrupt themselves. They change direction mid-sentence. They soften their why opinions. They imply things instead of stating them clearly. And if you don't train your ear for that, conversations can feel exhausting, even if your vocabulary is strong. So today, we begin with awareness, because awareness is the first step toward mastery. I want you to start noticing how English actually sounds in natural conversation. Not slow, not scripted, not simplified, but real, dynamic, human. Let me give you an example. Imagine two colleagues talking after a meeting. One of them says, "Well, that was interesting." Now at a basic level, you understand every word. But what does it mean? Was it genuinely interesting? Was it boring? Was it chaotic? Was it disappointing? The meaning depends entirely on tone, stress, facial expression, and context. If the speaker slightly stretches the word interesting and lowers their voice, it often implies criticism. If they say it quickly with enthusiasm, it may be genuine excitement. So your listening skill at this level must go beyond vocabulary. You must listen to energy, rhythm, and intention. Now I want you to try something with me. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine someone saying, "That's fine." Hear it once in a warm tone. "That's fine." Now hear it again in a flat, cold tone. "That's fine." Same words, completely different meaning. In the second version, it probably doesn't feel fine at all, does it? This is why advanced listening requires emotional intelligence. You are not just translating language. You are interpreting human behavior through language. And that takes practice, intentional, focused practice. Let's explore another daily life situation. Imagine a friend asking you, "Are you coming to the dinner tonight?" And you respond, "I'll try." On paper, that sounds positive, but in real conversational English, "I'll try" often means probably not. It is a polite way to avoid direct refusal. If you interpret it literally, you may misunderstand the situation. So here is your first listening awareness exercise. I will describe short responses, and I want you to think about the implied meaning behind them, not the literal one. Someone says, "Sure, if you want." Does it sound enthusiastic or does it sound reluctant? Most of the time, it suggests indifference or mild resistance. Someone says, "Yeah, I guess so." That hesitation, that soft uncertainty tells you the speaker is not fully convinced. Someone says, "Right," after you explain something. Is that agreement or quiet disagreement? Again, it depends on tone. Now pause for a moment and reflect. When you listen to English conversations, do you focus only on words, or do you also pay attention to delivery? At C1 and C2 level, your goal is to reduce mental translation completely. You should not be converting English into your native language in your mind, because that slows you down. Instead, you should process meaning directly, in English, as ideas, not as separate words. Here is a short advanced listening simulation for you. I'll describe a conversation naturally, and afterward, I'll guide you through what you should have noticed. Two friends are discussing a job offer. One says, "I mean, it's a good opportunity. Don't get me wrong, but I'm not sure it's the right move right now." Did you notice the phrase, "don't get me wrong"? That's a softening device. It signals that the speaker is about to express something slightly negative while trying to maintain harmony. Advanced listeners immediately recognize these transition signals. Now listen to this. All continuation. It's just, "With everything going on, I don't know if adding more responsibility makes sense." The phrase "with everything going on" is intentionally vague. It could refer to family issues, financial stress, health concerns, or emotional burnout. Native speakers often leave details unsaid, assuming shared context, and you must become comfortable with ambiguity. Ambiguity is not your enemy. It is part of real communication. Let's go deeper. One of the biggest challenges at this level is speed variation. Native speakers speed up when they are comfortable, excited, or emotionally engaged, and slow down when they are careful, serious, or emphasizing something important. If you only practice with evenly paced audio, real conversations will feel overwhelming. So here's your next exercise. I want you to imagine someone telling a story excitedly. So I walk into the room and guess who I see? My old manager from 5 years ago. I couldn't believe it. Notice how the pacing naturally increases. Now imagine the same speaker saying, "The thing is, I didn't know how to react." Slower, more reflective. Advanced listening means tracking these shifts without losing comprehension. Another subtle feature you must train yourself to hear is connected speech. Words blend together, disappear, or change sound completely. For example, "What are you going to do?" often becomes, "What you gonna do?" If you only trained with textbook pronunciation, this may confuse you. But instead of feeling frustrated, train your ear to expect reduction. It's normal. It's natural. It's how fluent speech works. Now I want you to practice active prediction. Prediction is a powerful listening strategy. When someone begins a sentence, your brain should anticipate possible endings. This reduces processing time. For example, if someone says, "To be honest," you can predict that a sincere or possibly critical comment will follow. If someone says, "At the end of the day," you expect a summarizing opinion. Let's practice. I'll start a sentence and pause mentally to predict how it might continue. I'm not saying it's impossible, but what do you expect next? Probably a doubt or a limitation. It's not that I don't care. It's just you expect justification. This predictive listening skill dramatically increases real-time comprehension. Now let's simulate a slightly more complex conversational exchange. Person A says, "Have you thought any more about relocating?" Person B, I responds, "I have. And honestly, it's tempting. But I can't shake the feeling that I'd regret leaving." Notice the internal conflict expressed through contrast words like "but." This signals emotional complexity. Advanced listening requires emotional mapping. Who is confident? Who is uncertain? Who is persuading? Who is defending? Now I want you to slow down with me for a moment. Take a breath and reflect on this. Listening at this level is not passive. It is analytical, intuitive, and emotional at the same time. You are training your brain to decode layers instantly. Let's practice with implied criticism. Imagine someone saying, "Well, that's one way to do it." On the surface, neutral, but often it implies disagreement or subtle disapproval. Or someone says, "Interesting choice." That could imply surprise, confusion, or doubt. Now ask yourself, would you catch that nuance immediately in real conversation? If not, that's completely normal. This is exactly what we are ear training today. Advanced listening also includes understanding fillers and hesitation markers. Words like, "you know," "I mean," "kind of," "sort of," "actually." These words are not meaningless. They show uncertainty, correction, emphasis, or softening. For example, "I actually didn't mind it." The word "actually" suggests contrast with expectation, or "it was kind of disappointing." The phrase kind of reduces the intensity. You must train your ear to detect these micro signals. Now here's a longer practice paragraph for you. Listen carefully in your mind as I read it naturally. I thought the presentation was well structured and overall pretty informative, but I couldn't help feeling that it dragged a little in the middle. Maybe it's just me, but I think tightening it up would make a big difference. Did you notice how the speaker balanced praise and criticism? That's very common in professional English. Direct negativity is often softened. Now imagine responding appropriately, not defensively, but thoughtfully. That's conversational competence built on listening accuracy. As we continue in this session, we'll gradually increase complexity, exploring layered dialogue, subtle disagreement, humor, irony, and advanced discourse markers. For now, I want you to remember one core idea. Listening at C1 and C2 is about interpretation, not translation. It's about recognizing patterns, anticipating direction, and sensing emotional undercurrents. And this is just Hachiram, the beginning. Now let's move deeper into advanced listening, because at this level, the difficulty is rarely vocabulary. It's density. When people speak at a C1 or C2 level, ideas are packed tightly together, meaning is layered, and opinions are often expressed indirectly. So your brain must learn to unpack information quickly without feeling overwhelmed. One important feature of advanced conversational English is hedging. Hedging is when speakers soften their statements to avoid sounding too direct, too confident, or too confrontational. For example, instead of saying, "You're wrong," a native speaker might say, "I'm not entirely convinced that's accurate." Now listen to the difference. That's incorrect. Compared to, "I'm not sure that quite reflects the whole picture." The second sentence is more diplomatic, more nuanced, and more common in professional or academic environments. If you only listen for strong, direct language, you may miss disagreement completely. So here's a listening reflection exercise. Imagine you are in a team meeting. Someone says, "That's an interesting proposal. I just wonder whether we've considered the long-term implications." What does that really mean? It likely means they see a potential problem, but they are expressing it carefully. At the C1 and C2 level, disagreement is often disguised as curiosity. Let's explore tone shifts in longer responses, because advanced speakers often change tone mid-sentence to adjust meaning. Consider, in this sentence, "I see what you're saying, and in theory it makes sense, but in practice, I'm not sure it would work." Notice how the speaker first validates the other person, then introduces doubt. The phrase "in theory" signals contrast. It prepares you for skepticism. If you are not trained to hear these transition markers, you may incorrectly assume agreement. Now let's practice active listening through a simulated conversation. I want you to visualize it clearly. Two friends are discussing whether to start a business together. One says, I love the idea, and I think we'd make a great team. It's just the timing feels a bit off." Pause for a moment. What is the emotional tone here? There is enthusiasm, but also hesitation. The phrase "it's just" signals emotional conflict. The speaker continues, "With the economy being so unpredictable, I don't know if it's the smartest move right now. Notice how uncertainty is layered into the explanation. It's not a flat refusal. It's thoughtful caution. Now I want you to imagine responding. If you misunderstand and say, "So you don't believe in us?" that would be too extreme. Because the speaker did not reject the idea. They questioned timing. Advanced listening means distinguishing between rejection, hesitation, and caution. Let's examine another subtle element, implied emotion through pacing. When someone is excited, their sentences often overlap. It was amazing. Honestly, I didn't expect it to go that well. And then when they announced the results, I just couldn't believe it. But when someone is anxious or reflective, their speech may slow down. I don't know. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'm not sure what the right decision is. Those small pauses, those repeated words, they communicate vulnerability. Here is a focused listening exercise for you. I will describe a short monologue, and afterward, I want you to identify 3 things in your mind: the speaker's attitude, their emotional state, and their level of certainty. Listen, I suppose I could apply for the position. I mean, I meet most of the qualifications, but there's always that voice in the back of my mind saying, I'm not quite ready. Maybe I'm overthinking it. I tend to do that. Now reflect. The speaker is hesitant, self-doubting, moderately qualified, but lacking confidence. The words, I suppose, most, not quite, maybe, all soften certainty. If you catch those patterns instantly, you're operating at a high listening level. Let's talk about implied meaning in humor, because humor is one of the hardest aspects of advanced listening. Imagine someone arrives late to a meeting and another person says, "Nice of you to join us." Literally, it sounds polite, but the tone likely carries sarcasm. Sarcasm depends heavily on vocal stress and context. Without sensitivity to tone, you may misinterpret the speaker's intention. Now imagine this exchange. Person A says, "Did you finish our report?" Person B replies, "Oh, absolutely, in my dreams." The phrase "in my dreams" clearly signals irony. Advanced listening requires quick recognition of exaggeration and irony. Let's move to a more complex example involving layered argumentation. Imagine someone explaining their opinion on remote work. Well, on the one hand, working from home offers flexibility, and I think that's invaluable for work-life balance. But at the same time, there's something to be said for in-person collaboration. You just can't replicate spontaneous brainstorming over a screen. Notice the balanced structure. On the one hand, at the same time, these are discourse markers signaling structured reasoning. When listening to advanced speakers, train yourself to mentally map argument structure. Are they presenting advantages first? Are they building toward a conclusion? Are they leaving it open-ended? Now here's a deeper practice passage. Listen closely. I used to think productivity was, all about discipline. Setting strict schedules and sticking to them. But lately, I've started to realize that energy management might be more important than time management. If you're exhausted, no amount of planning will help. Did you notice the evolution of thought? The phrase, "I used to think," signals past belief. But lately, signals shift. I've started to realize signals reflection. Advanced listening means tracking cognitive development in real time. Now let's challenge your listening with subtle emotional contrast. I'm happy for you. Truly. I just wish things had turned out differently for me. The speaker expresses both happiness and disappointment simultaneously. If you focus only on the first clause, you miss the emotional complexity. Let's practice shadow listening in your mind. Repeat silently after me, matching rhythm and pauses. I see your point. I really do. I'm just not sure I agree entirely. Feel the softness in that sentence. It avoids conflict, all while expressing difference. Now another one. It's not that I don't value your input. It's just that we're under a lot of pressure right now. Notice how responsibility is shifted from person to circumstance. These patterns are everywhere in advanced conversation, especially in professional settings. Now let's focus on conversational repair. Another advanced listening skill. Native speakers often correct themselves mid-sentence. I was thinking we could meet on Thursday. Actually, Friday might. Why be better? Or, it's not a bad idea. Well, it's not a great idea either, but it has potential. These repairs show spontaneous thought. If you panic when a sentence changes direction, you lose comprehension. Instead, stay flexible. Now I want to simulate a longer narrative for focused listening stamina, because stamina is essential at C1/C2 level. You must sustain attention for extended periods. Listen carefully. I didn't expect the conference to be so overwhelming, not in a bad way, just intense. There were so many perspectives, so many debates happening simultaneously. I found myself questioning assumptions I didn't even realize I had. And by the end of the day, I wasn't exhausted physically, but mentally. I felt stretched. Pause. Did you notice the distinction between physical and mental exhaustion? Did you catch the subtle self-reflection? Advanced listening means processing abstract thought, not just concrete events. Now take a slow breath with me. Listening at this. A level is a skill that combines linguistic knowledge, psychological awareness, pattern recognition, and emotional interpretation. You are training your brain to think in English, react in English, and interpret nuance in English without translating, without freezing. In the next part, we will move into even more sophisticated territory, including indirect persuasion, subtle disagreement in debate, and conversational dominance shifts. For now, reflect on what we practiced. Listen beyond words. Hear tone shifts. Notice hedging. Track argument structure. Identify implied emotion. And most importantly, stay calm while listening, because calmness allows clarity. Now we are going to move into a more sophisticated layer of advanced listening, the kind of listening that happens in debates, negotiations, interviews, and intellectually demanding conversations. This is where speakers are not just exchanging information. They are positioning themselves, persuading subtly, protecting their image, or testing the other person's reasoning. At this level, listening becomes strategic. Imagine you are listening to a panel discussion. One speaker says, "While I appreciate the optimism surrounding this initiative, I think we need to remain realistic about the constraints we're facing." On the surface, This sounds balanced, calm, reasonable, but underneath, it is a cautious challenge to overly positive thinking. The phrase, while I appreciate, softens disagreement, and remain realistic. It suggests skepticism. Now imagine another panelist responding. I understand your concerns, but if we keep focusing on limitations, we may never innovate. Did you notice the shift? The second speaker reframes the idea. They subtly imply that caution might be holding progress back. Advanced listening means detecting reframing techniques. Reframing happens when someone takes the same situation, but presents it through a different emotional or conceptual lens. For example, person A says, "It's risky." Person B replies, "It's bold." Same situation, different framing. If you are listening passively, you may miss how powerfully the narrative just changed. Now let's practice deeper inference, because C2 listening often requires drawing conclusions that are not directly stated. Listen carefully to this scenario. I mean, it's not that the role isn't attractive. It's just that I've invested so much time building my current team. Walking away now feels complicated. The speaker never or says, "I'm declining the offer." But the emotional weight suggests reluctance to leave. Now I want you to reflect. What are the emotional keywords here? Invested, so much time, walking away, complicated. These words signal attachment, loyalty, internal conflict. This is the kind of listening that requires emotional sensitivity. Let's raise the difficulty slightly. Imagine someone being interviewed about a controversial decision. Well, in hindsight, there are certainly aspects we could all have handled differently, but at the time, we were operating with the information available to us. This is a classic defensive structure. The phrase "in hindsight" acknowledges imperfection, but operating with the information available justifies the action. The speaker admits minor fault while protecting credibility. Now pause. If you were listening quickly, you might only hear accountability. But if you listen carefully, you hear strategic reputation management. That's advanced comprehension. Let's explore conversational dominance shifts. In some conversations, one person subtly takes control of direction. Imagine two colleagues brainstorming. One says, "That's an interesting direction, but perhaps we should first clarify our objectives before diving into solutions." With that sentence, the speaker redirected the conversation. The word "first" is key. It signals structural authority. Now imagine the other person responding. "Fair point. So what do you think our here primary objective should be?" Notice how conversational control has shifted. Advanced listening involves noticing who is guiding the discussion and how. Now let's move into indirect persuasion, which is common in high-level English conversation. Instead of saying, "You should reconsider," a speaker might say, "Have you thought about approaching it from a slightly different angle?" Instead of "You're mistaken," they might say, "I wonder if there might be another interpretation." These all phrases are soft, but persuasive. Here's a listening practice simulation. I'm not suggesting we abandon the idea altogether. I'm simply proposing that we refine it before moving forward. The speaker is not rejecting. They are reshaping. Now imagine the emotional tone behind this sentence. Is it supportive? Is it critical? It depends entirely on delivery. At C1 and C2 levels, tone interpretation becomes as important as lexical comprehension. Let's challenge your stamina again with a longer, just advanced monologue. I've always valued stability, probably more than I realized, and when the opportunity to relocate came up, I initially dismissed it. It felt disruptive, unnecessary. But over time, I started questioning whether my attachment to routine was actually limiting my growth. Sometimes what feels safe isn't necessarily what helps you evolve. Pause. Notice the philosophical tone, the self-analysis, the gradual development of thought. Advanced listening requires comfort with abstract reflection, not just practical description. Now let's examine subtle emotional contradiction. I'm excited about the project. Genuinely. I just don't want expectations to get out of hand. This expresses enthusiasm, combined with caution. Or consider this one. I respect her expertise. I just find her communication style a bit overwhelming. Respect, mixed with criticism. These layered statements are common in professional environments. If you can instantly identify both emotional layers, you are listening at an advanced level. Now let's introduce conversational ambiguity. Sometimes speakers intentionally remain vague. For various reasons, we decided it wasn't the right time. Various reasons leaves details unsaid. Or, things have been a bit complicated lately. Complicated how? Professionally, personally, emotionally. Advanced listeners tolerate ambiguity without panic. Now I want to strengthen your inferencing skill. Imagine you hear this sentence. You're confident in meetings. Depending on tone, this could be praise or subtle criticism implying arrogance. Context determines meaning. Now here is a slightly longer dialogue for focused interpretation. Person A says, "So, how did your performance review go?" Person B replies, "It was constructive." That pause before constructive suggests mixed feedback. If it had been entirely positive, the response might be quicker. Now B continues, "There are definitely areas I need to work on, but appreciate the clarity." This confirms balanced feedback. Advanced listening involves interpreting pacing before content even finishes. Let's move into rapid conversational exchange simulation. I get that you're frustrated, but reacting impulsively might make things worse. What is happening here? Validation, followed by caution. Or this one. I'm not opposed to the idea. I just need more convincing. Not rejection, but resistance. Now let's deepen your practice. I want you to mentally shadow this advanced reflection, matching rhythm. Sometimes we confuse being busy with being productive, and the two aren't necessarily the same. Feel the intellectual tone. Now another. It's easy to criticize from the outside, but decision-making looks very different when you're accountable. Notice the contrast structure. Contrast is everywhere in advanced speech. Let's practice identifying discourse markers in a longer passage. Initially, I was hesitant to voice my opinion. Partly, because I didn't want to disrupt the consensus. However, as the discussion progressed, it became clear that silence might be interpreted as agreement. Ultimately, I decided it was better to express my concerns respectfully. Words like initially, however, ultimately, organize the narrative. If you mentally track those markers, comprehension becomes smoother. Now take a slow breath with me. You are not just listening to English, you are listening to psychology, strategy, social dynamics, and identity management. This level of listening requires patience, curiosity, and emotional neutrality. Now we're going to stretch your listening endurance even further, because at the C1 and C2 level, one of the greatest challenges is sustaining attention during long, complex, and sometimes abstract conversations. It's one thing to understand a short exchange. It's another to follow a 10-minute explanation filled with layered arguments, subtle emotional cues, shifting perspectives, and embedded, see anecdotes, without losing the thread. So let's train that ability. Slowly, carefully, deliberately. I want you to imagine listening to someone recount a complicated experience at work. It started off as a fairly straightforward project, or at least that's what we thought. The objective was clear, the timeline seemed reasonable, and everyone appeared aligned. But as we moved into the execution phase, small inconsistencies began to surface. Nothing dramatic at first, just minor miscommunications. Missed deadlines, assumptions that hadn't been clarified. Pause mentally for a moment. Notice how the speaker is building tension gradually. They're not saying it failed. They're describing the unraveling process step by step. This gradual unfolding is common in advanced storytelling. Now the speaker continues. At one point, I realized that we weren't actually disagreeing about the goal. We were disagreeing about the definition of success. And that distinction changed everything. Did you catch that conceptual shift? The difference between goal and definition of success, that's abstract reasoning. Advanced listening requires you to follow conceptual distinctions, not just events. Now I want you to reflect. If you were tired, distracted, or translating in your head, would you catch that subtle shift? Or would the idea slip past you? That's why mental stamina is critical. Let's continue the narrative. I think what surprised me most wasn't the disagreement itself. It was how differently each person interpreted the same data. The numbers hadn't changed, but the conclusions certainly had. Notice the reflective tone. The speaker is analyzing human perception. This is the type of abstract commentary you'll encounter in high-level discussions, podcasts, interviews, academic conversations. Now, let's increase complexity. I don't necessarily regret how things unfolded. In fact, in some ways, the tension forced us to confront assumptions we'd been avoiding. But I do wish we'd communicated more transparently from the outset. It might have saved us a great deal of frustration. Here we see mixed reflection, acceptance, mild regret, balanced perspective. Advanced listening means recognizing emotional balance. Now I want to challenge you with layered opinion. Imagine someone speaking about social media. On the surface, it promises connection, and in many cases, it delivers exactly that. But beneath that convenience, there's an undercurrent of comparison, share performance, and subtle pressure to curate a version of ourselves that may not fully align with reality. Pause. That is abstract language. Undercurrent. Cure it. Align with reality. At this level, vocabulary becomes metaphorical. Advanced listening requires comfort with metaphor. Now here's your focused comprehension exercise. Based on that statement, is the speaker completely against social media? No. They acknowledged its value, but highlighted hidden consequences. If you only hear your criticism, you miss the balance. Now let's simulate a debate-style exchange. Person A says, "We can't ignore the environmental implications of rapid industrial growth." Person B responds, "True, but halting progress entirely isn't realistic either. The real question is how we innovate responsibly." Notice how person B reframes the discussion. They shift from stop growth to responsible innovation. That shift is subtle but powerful. Advanced listeners track argument redirection instantly. Now let's practice detecting conversational tension. Imagine this dialogue. "I understand why you made that decision. I really do. I just wish I'd been consulted beforehand." The phrase, "I understand," signals empathy. But the second clause expresses hurt. If you only focus on the first half, you misread the emotional landscape. Now listen to this. "I'm not angry. I'm just disappointed." Disappointment often carries deeper emotional weight than anger. Recognizing emotional hierarchy is part of advanced listening. Let's move into a long, reflective monologue to build your stamina. There's something about uncertainty that unsettles us, not necessarily because we fear failure, but because we fear losing control. When outcomes are predictable, even if they're difficult, we feel anchored. But when variables multiply, when the path forward feels ambiguous, we begin to question our own judgment. And that self-doubt can be far more destabilizing than the external challenge itself. Take a slow breath. Did you follow the progression? Uncertainty, control, predictability, ambiguity, self-doubt, destabilization. This is layered psychological reasoning. At C2 level, you must comfortably process abstract cause and effect relationships. Now let's practice implied contradiction. I wouldn't say I'm opposed to change. I just believe it should be approached cautiously. That's cautious conservatism, not rejection or consider. It's not that the idea lacks merit. It's that its implementation requires careful planning. Again, subtle critique disguised as practicality. Now I want to strengthen your inferential skill even further. Imagine someone describing a colleague. He's incredibly detail-oriented, sometimes to a fault. The phrase "to a fault" transforms praise into mild criticism. If you miss that idiomatic nuance, you miss the full meaning. Let's explore irony under subtle pressure. In a tense situation, someone says, "Well, that went smoothly." Tone undetermines whether this is literal or ironic. Now imagine the same sentence said with a light laugh versus a tight jaw. Emotion reshapes meaning. Advanced listening demands emotional imagination. Now here is a longer advanced dialogue simulation. Person A says, "I've been thinking about taking a step back from leadership, at least temporarily." Person B replies, "That's unexpected. Is this about workload or something else?" Person A responds, "It's not burnout exactly. It's more that I want Trying to reassess what impact I'm actually having. Pause. Notice the careful phrasing. Not burnout exactly. Signals clarification. Now, person A continues. I don't want to lead just for the sake of the title. If I'm not adding value, I'd rather rethink my role. This reveals introspection, identity reflection. Advanced listening includes understanding identity-based motivation. Now take another slow breath. You are training yourself to remain mentally steady while navigating complexity. You are building tolerance for ambiguity, for abstraction, for layered emotion. This is what separates competent listeners from truly advanced ones. Now we're going to explore something even more subtle and even more powerful, hidden assumptions. Because at the C1 and C2 level, a great deal of meaning lives beneath the surface of what is actually spoken. When someone speaks, they are not only expressing ideas, they are revealing beliefs, values, expectations, and sometimes unconscious bias. And if you train yourself to hear those underlying assumptions, your listening ability becomes extraordinarily sharp. Let me give you an example. Imagine someone says, well, of course she was promoted. She's always been ambitious. At first glance, this sounds neutral, perhaps even positive. But listen carefully. There may be an implied tone suggesting that ambition is somehow questionable, depending on delivery. Or consider this sentence. He's surprisingly articulate. The word surprisingly carries an assumption. Why would articulate speech be unexpected? Advanced listening means detecting what the speaker assumes, not just what they state. Now let's practice this skill together. I'll give you a short statement, and I want you to identify the hidden assumption behind it. If he really cared, he would have shown up. The hidden assumption is that caring is proven through physical presence. That may or may not be true, but the speaker believes it. Now try this one. She's very successful. Considering her background, what is implied about her background? These are the kinds of nuances that appear constantly in high-level conversations, especially in debates, interviews, and social commentary. Now let's move into power dynamics, because advanced conversations often involve subtle shifts in authority. Imagine a workplace discussion. One colleague says, I see your point, but we've always handled it this way. The phrase, we've always handled it this way, invokes tradition as, authority. It implies that change requires strong justification. Now imagine the other colleague responds. Tradition can be useful, but it shouldn't prevent improvement. This reframes tradition as potential limitation. Advanced listening requires noticing these underlying value systems. Now let's build your stamina again with a longer reflective passage. I've noticed that in group discussions, the loudest voices often dominate the outcome, not necessarily because they have the strongest arguments, but because silence is frequently interpreted as agreement. And I wonder how many perspectives remain unheard simply because they weren't delivered confidently enough. Pause for a moment. Did you follow the implicit critique? The speaker is questioning group dynamics, not individuals. Now reflect. The phrase silence is frequently interpreted as agreement carries a powerful social observation. At the C2 level, you must track social commentary embedded within storytelling. Let's increase the challenge. Imagine a political interview. The interviewer asks, "Do you take responsibility for the outcome?" The politician replies, "Leadership is never about one individual. It's about collective decision making." Notice how the question was not answered directly. Instead of saying yes or no, the speaker reframed the responsibility as shared. Advanced listening requires noticing evasion. Now imagine the interviewer follows up. "But as the leader, didn't the final decision rest with you?" Now the pressure increases. The politician responds, "I stand by the decision we made, given the circumstances at the time." Again, no direct admission of fault, but strong defensive context. This is strategic communication. Now let's practice rapid conversational shifts. I will present a sequence of statements, and I want you to mentally track emotional direction. I appreciate the feedback. Neutral, open. Some of it was difficult to hear. Vulnerability. But I suppose that's part of growth. Acceptance. Reflection. See how emotional progression moves from neutrality to discomfort to maturity. Advanced listening means tracking emotional evolution across sentences. Now, let's work with subtle humor under tension. Imagine a manager saying after a failed presentation, "Well, at least it was memorable." This could be light humor to reduce embarrassment, or subtle criticism disguised as a joke. Tone is everything. Now consider this sentence. "I'm glad we had that." On discussion. Said warmly. It implies resolution. Said coldly. It implies unresolved tension. At this level, your ear must become sensitive to micro variations in pitch and pacing. Let's move into long-form narrative interpretation again. I used to believe that confidence meant certainty, that strong leaders never hesitated, never questioned themselves. But over time, I've realized that the most effective leaders are often the ones who pause, who reflect, who admit uncertainty, not as weakness, but as responsibility. Pause. Did you hear the shift from past belief to evolved understanding? Phrases like, "I used to believe." Signal transformation. Advanced listening requires recognizing narrative arc. Now here's a comprehension challenge. Based on that monologue, does the speaker now value hesitation? Yes, but in a reflective sense. They redefine confidence. Now let's explore emotional subtext in personal relationships. Imagine someone saying, "It's fine. You do what you think is best." Literally, permission. But depending on tone, it may imply disappointment or resignation or genuine support. If you misread that tone, conflict can arise. Now I want you to mentally practice shadowing this emotionally layered statement. I don't expect perfection. I just expect honesty. Notice the emphasis on value. Now another one. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to understand me. That distinction is powerful. Advanced listeners detect the emotional weight behind such distinctions. Let's now stretch your processing speed slightly. Imagine a fast-paced discussion between entrepreneurs. If we scale too quickly, we risk compromising quality. But if we move too slowly, competitors will overtake us. So the real question isn't whether to grow, it's how to grow sustainably. This is layered logic under pressure. If your attention drifts, you lose the central question. Now take a breath. Listening at C1 and C2 is not about perfection. It's about pattern, recognition, composure, and mental flexibility. You must stay calm even when speech accelerates. You must tolerate uncertainty when details are vague. You must identify emotional undertones when words seem neutral. And you must track arguments as they evolve. Now let's build endurance with one final long passage in this section. There's a difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is immediate, emotional, often impulsive. Responding requires a pause, a moment of analysis, a willingness to consider consequences. And in high-pressure environments, that pause can feel uncomfortable, even unnatural. But it's precisely that pause that distinguishes thoughtful decision-making from instinctive reaction. Pause slowly. Did you follow the contrast structure? Reacting versus responding. Immediate versus deliberate. Discomfort versus growth. This is high-level reasoning expressed through contrast. Advanced listening requires recognizing structural symmetry. Now reflect on how far you've come in this session. You're not just hearing English. You're decoding intention, navigating abstraction, sensing power shifts, recognizing hidden assumptions, and following emotional nuance. Now we are going to push your listening skills into even more demanding territory. Because at the C1 and C2 level, real conversations are rarely neat, rarely linear, and rarely emotionally simple. People interrupt themselves, change direction, revise their opinions mid-sentence, and embed the stories inside other stories. And if your attention is not flexible, you lose the thread. So in this section, we will focus on spontaneous conversational pivots and how to remain mentally agile when direction shifts unexpectedly. Imagine someone beginning a story like this. I wasn't planning to say anything at first because honestly, it didn't seem worth the conflict. But then something happened that made me reconsider. Now pause. Your brain expects to hear what happened, but instead, the speaker continues. Actually, before I explain that, I should probably give you some background. That shift from event to background explanation is very common in natural speech. Advanced listeners do not feel frustrated by these detours. They mentally hold the original thread while absorbing the context. Let's continue the story. So a few months ago, our team went through a restructuring phase, which at the time seemed minor, but in retrospect, changed the dynamic significantly. Notice the time shift, present reflection on past event. Now the speaker circles back. And that's why, when the new proposal was introduced, I couldn't stay silent. Did you track the return to the original tension? Frustrated by these detours. They mentally hold the original thread while absorbing the context. Let's continue the story. So a few months ago, our team went through a restructuring phase, which at the time seemed minor, but in retrospect, changed the dynamic significantly. Notice the time shift, present reflection on past event. Now the speaker circles back. And that's why, when the new proposal was introduced, I couldn't stay silent. Did you track the return to the original tension? This is narrative looping, and you must be comfortable with it. Now let's challenge your listening with embedded meaning inside storytelling. Imagine someone sharing a personal experience. I remember sitting in that meeting, feeling like everyone else had already made up their mind. Our discussion was technically open, but the outcome felt predetermined. You know that feeling when participation is invited, but not really welcomed. Pause. The speaker is not only describing a meeting, they are commenting on performative inclusion. Advanced listening means recognizing social critique embedded within anecdote. Now let's intensify complexity slightly. I don't think anyone intended to exclude alternative perspectives, at least not consciously, but the way the agenda was structured. It subtly guided us toward a specific conclusion. Notice the careful phrasing. The speaker avoids direct accusation, but implies structural bias. Now reflect. If you were listening quickly, you might only hear neutrality. But if you listen carefully, you detect gentle criticism. Now let's practice layered debate. Imagine a discussion about artificial intelligence. One participant says, technological advancement has always been disruptive, but disruption doesn't automatically equate to harm. In many cases, it forces necessary adaptation. Another participant responds, that may be true historically, but the scale and speed of this transformation are unprecedented, and we can't assume past resilience guarantees future stability. Pause. Did you catch the contrast? The first speaker draws on historical analogy. The second questions the validity of that analogy. Advanced listening requires identifying argumentative strategy. Is someone using precedent? Is someone challenging? Relevance? Now let's practice emotional restraint detection. Imagine someone responding to criticism. I hear what you're saying, and I appreciate your honesty. I just need some time to process it. The speaker is not rejecting feedback, but they are creating emotional space. Or consider this. I'm not dismissing your concern. I just think we might be approaching it from different assumptions. That phrase, different assumptions, signals intellectual disagreement without personal attack. Now, and will increase speed and density slightly. I think what's happening here isn't necessarily a lack of competence, but rather a misalignment of expectations. We assumed one timeline, stakeholders assumed another, and somewhere in that gap, frustration developed. Notice the structural clarity. Cause and effect. Advanced listening means tracking causal chains effortlessly. Now let's move into subtle emotional escalation. I'm not upset. I'm just disappointed that this keeps happening. The pause. Before disappointed carries emotional weight. Now imagine the same sentence spoken quickly without pause. It feels less intense. Micro pauses matter. At this level, listening becomes almost musical. You are hearing rhythm as much as meaning. Now let's challenge your endurance again with a longer abstract reflection. There's an interesting paradox in leadership. On the one hand, decisiveness inspires confidence. People want clarity, direction, assurance. But on the other hand, rigid certainty can alienate those who feel unheard. So effective leadership requires a balance. The courage to decide, paired with the humility to reconsider. Pause slowly. Did you follow the symmetrical structure? decisiveness versus rigidity, courage versus humility. Advanced listening requires recognizing parallel construction. Now let's simulate a fast-moving exchange where speakers interrupt slightly. I get that the numbers look promising. They do. But projections don't always translate into reality. True, but if we wait for absolute certainty, we'll never move. Notice the overlap, the quick back and forth. In real conversations, especially debates, this rhythm is common. Advanced listeners do not freeze during interruption. They absorb partial phrases and predict continuation. Now let's practice prediction under pressure. If someone says, "With all due respect, what do you expect next?" Often, disagreement. If someone says, "I might be wrong, but," you anticipate a cautious opinion. Prediction reduces cognitive load. Now let's explore identity signaling in advanced speech. I've always considered myself someone who values consistency, so this sudden shift in direction feels unsettling. The speaker defines identity first, then expresses discomfort. Identity framing is powerful. Now listen to this. As someone who thrives on challenge, I actually welcomed the uncertainty. Same situation, different identity lens. Advanced listening means noticing how people frame themselves to justify emotion. Now I want you to stretch your focus with one extended layered narrative. When I first entered the industry, I believed success was purely merit-based, that hard work inevitably led to recognition. And while effort certainly matters, I've since realized that visibility, timing, and relationships play an equally significant role. That realization was uncomfortable because it challenged my sense of fairness, but it also pushed me to become more strategic rather than simply more diligent. Pause. Did you track the internal evolution, belief, realization, discomfort, adaptation? That is cognitive progression within narrative. Advanced listening requires holding multi-stage reasoning in your mind simultaneously. Now take a slow breath. Notice how your brain feels. If you feel slightly stretched, that's good. Growth happens at the edge of comfort. Listening at this level demands sustained attention, emotional neutrality, a rapid inference, structural awareness, and predictive processing. You are building all of that right now. Now we are going to move into emotionally charged territory because advanced listening is tested most intensely when emotion enters the conversation. When people feel defensive, passionate, disappointed, or deeply invested, their speech changes, their rhythm shifts, their word choice sharpens, and sometimes their clarity decreases. At the C1 and C2 level, you must remain steady, even when the speaker is not. Let's begin with a high-pressure discussion scenario. Imagine two colleagues discussing a failed partnership. One says, "I don't think we can ignore the fact that warnings were raised months ago, and yet nothing was done." Notice the emphasis on warnings. This is not just information, it's accountability. Now the other colleague responds, "That's not entirely fair. Decisions were made based on the information we had at the time." Pause. This is defensive positioning. The phrase "not entirely fair" softens confrontation, but it still challenges the accusation. Now imagine the first colleague continues, "Perhaps, But some of us felt those concerns weren't taken seriously. That phrase, some of us, introduces collective frustration. Advanced listening requires noticing when individual frustration becomes collective sentiment. Now let's intensify the emotional layer slightly. I'm not trying to assign blame. I'm trying to understand how we prevent this from happening again. On the surface, constructive. But it also implies that blame is possible. If you misread tone, you might assume pure cooperation. At this level, emotional undertones are everything. Now let's shift into subtle irony during tension. After a stressful event, someone says, "Well, that was enlightening." Depending on tone, this could mean valuable insight or complete frustration. Now imagine it spoken slowly, with a controlled smile. You sense restrained sarcasm. Now let's explore. Layered argument inside emotional debate. I agree that the outcome was disappointing, but focusing solely on what went wrong won't help us improve. We need to identify what worked and build from there. Did you notice how the speaker acknowledges negativity, but redirects focus toward progress? That's emotional reframing. Advanced listeners identify reframing in real time. Now let's practice detecting escalation signals. I've brought this up before. This sentence alone suggests share frustration. Add emphasis. I've brought this up before. Now it implies repetition, perhaps feeling ignored. Microemphasis changes emotional intensity. Now imagine someone says quietly, "I just expected more." Soft tone, deep disappointment. Advanced listening requires sensitivity to volume, not just words. Now let's challenge your endurance with a long, emotionally layered monologue. I never wanted this to turn into a confrontation. Honestly, I believed we were aligned on the core objective. But somewhere along the way, priorities shifted, or at least that's how it felt from my perspective. And maybe I should have spoken up sooner. Maybe I assumed consensus when there wasn't any. But what troubles me most isn't the disagreement itself. It's the silence that followed. Pause. Did you follow the internal conflict? The speaker balances self-reflection with subtle critique. Advanced listening means distinguishing accountability from accusation. Now let's move into complex storytelling, all with subtle irony. I used to pride myself on being adaptable, someone who could adjust to any environment. And in many ways, I still believe that. But recently, I've started to question whether constant adaptation is always healthy. At what point does flexibility become self-erasure? Pause slowly. That last sentence is philosophical. The speaker is not talking about scheduling or logistics. They are questioning identity boundaries. At C2 level, you must process abstract existential reflection comfortably. Now let's introduce multi-layered debate with competing values. Person A says, transparency builds trust, and without trust, collaboration collapses. Person B responds, true, but complete transparency can sometimes create unnecessary panic, especially when decisions are still evolving. Pause. Value clash. Trust versus stability. Advanced listening requires tracking competing priorities. Now let's increase speed slightly. If we overcorrect every minor error, we risk paralysis. But if we ignore early warning signs, we invite larger crises. Parallel structure, contrast, consequence. Your brain must hold both sides simultaneously. Now let's explore subtle emotional withdrawal. I suppose you're right. Flat tone may signal resignation rather than agreement. Or, let's just move on. Depending on context, it might mean resolution or avoidance. Now imagine a personal conversation. I don't need you to fix it. I just need you to listen. The emotional core is not solution, but validation. Advanced listeners recognize the emotional need behind the words. Now let's deepen complexity with a high-level reflective argument. There's a tendency in crisis situations to seek immediate clarity, to demand definitive answers. But sometimes, ambiguity is not a failure of leadership. It's an honest reflection of incomplete information. And acknowledging uncertainty can actually build credibility if communicated thoughtfully. Pause. Did you notice the reversal? Uncertainty reframed as strength. That's advanced rhetorical structure. Now let's push your stamina with one extended conceptual passage. Progress rarely follows a linear path. We prefer narratives that move neatly from challenge to triumph. But real growth often involves regression, missteps, and recalibration. And if we interpret every setback as failure rather than feedback, we risk abandoning meaningful pursuits prematurely. Pause. Track the progression. Narrative expectation. Contrast with reality. Reinterpretation of failure. Consequence of misinterpretation. Advanced listening requires recognizing logical flow, even in abstract reasoning. Now take a slow breath. Notice how we are operating at a higher cognitive density now. Sentences carry layered meaning. Emotion coexists with analysis. Irony hides beneath politeness. Power shifts quietly. And your task is to remain calm, alert, and curious. Now we're going to increase the cognitive intensity even further because at the highest levels of listening, especially in fast-paced discussions, people rarely pause to make their reasoning convenient for you. They speak in compressed logic. They assume shared knowledge, and they move rapidly between examples, theory, and implication. Your task is not to slow them down. Your task is to keep up calmly, without tension. Let's begin with a rapid conversational exchange that requires immediate processing. I'm not convinced scaling back is the answer, but where maintaining current output isn't sustainable either. Then maybe the issue isn't output. Maybe it's allocation. Allocation of what? Resources or responsibility? Both, because they're interconnected. Pause. Notice how quickly the topic evolved. From scaling back to sustainability to allocation to the relationship between resources and responsibility. Advanced listening means tracking topic evolution without feeling disoriented. Now let's layer in spontaneous rhetorical questions. Because rhetorical questions are rarely meant to be answered literally. Are we really prepared to sacrifice long-term stability for short-term gain? The speaker is not asking for data. They are emphasizing risk, or who benefits if we continue down this path? This question implies hidden interests. Advanced listeners recognize rhetorical intent instantly. Now let's stretch your abstract comprehension with philosophical storytelling. I used to believe that clarity was the ultimate goal in all communication, that if you articulated something precisely enough, misunderstanding would disappear. But over time, I've come to see that interpretation is shaped as much by the listener's experience as by the speaker's intention. And that realization changed how I approach difficult conversations. Pause slowly. Did you follow the conceptual shift? Clarity redefined. Communication reframed as shared responsibility. At C2 level, you must track internal redefinition of concepts. Now let's introduce subtle contradiction inside persuasive speech. I'm not arguing against innovation, far from it. I'm simply questioning whether innovation without ethical consideration truly qualifies as progress. That structure is sophisticated. The speaker protects their image as forward-thinking, while challenging the definition of progress. Advanced listening requires hearing both defense and critique simultaneously. Now let's simulate a high-speed intellectual debate. One could argue that increased automation enhances efficiency. Yes, but efficiency measured how? In output per hour or in long-term societal impact? That depends on whether you prioritize economic metrics over human variables. And who decides which priority takes precedence? Pause. This exchange contains layered variables: efficiency, measurement criteria, values, decision authority. If you lose track of one layer, the argument collapses in your mind. Advanced listening is about holding multiple conceptual threads simultaneously. Now let's explore subtle emotional masking. I'm fine with the outcome. Short sentence, neutral tone, but perhaps too neutral. Now imagine the same speaker adding, I just need a bit of time. That addition reveals processing, not indifference. Advanced listeners detect emotional processing hidden beneath surface calmness. Now let's challenge your endurance with a dense monologue filled with layered reasoning. There's an interesting tension between ambition and non-contentment. On the one hand, ambition drives innovation, growth, achievement, but unchecked ambition can erode presence, gratitude, and relational stability. So the question becomes, at what point does striving enhance life? And at what point does it begin to undermine it? Pause. That is not a practical question. It is existential. Advanced listening requires intellectual flexibility. Now let's introduce conversational pivots mid-thought. I thought I wanted immediate results. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. What I really wanted was reassurance that progress was happening, even if it was incremental. Notice the self-correction. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. Signals cognitive refinement. At C2 level, speakers refine their ideas while speaking. You must adapt in real time. Now let's practice recognizing implied hierarchy. I respect your perspective, though I think experience in this area matters. The second clause subtly elevates expertise as authority. Or consider. That's an interesting viewpoint, particularly from someone new to the field. Depending on tone, this could imply condescension. Advanced listening requires detecting implied status dynamics. Now let's move into extended storytelling with subtle irony woven in. When I finally achieved what I had been working toward for years, I expected a sense of completion, of arrival. Instead, what I felt was momentum, as if the achievement itself simply expanded the horizon rather than marking the destination. Pause. The irony is that success did not create finality, but further pursuit. Did you detect the philosophical tone? At C2 level, metaphor becomes frequent. Expanded the horizon implies limitless continuation. Now let's intensify cognitive load again. In complex systems, cause and effect are rarely linear. A minor policy shift can ripple outward, influencing behaviors in ways no one anticipated. And by the time consequences surface, the original decision may seem distant, almost unrelated, even though it initiated the chain. Pause slowly. Did you track that causal web? Advanced listening demands structural mapping in your mind. Now let's examine conversational dominance through questioning. What assumptions are we operating under? That question repositions the speaker as analytical leader. Or, before we proceed, can we clarify our objective? That phrase, before we proceed, reclaims direction. Advanced listeners notice when someone subtly guides momentum. Now let's push into emotionally complex dialogue again. I don't regret speaking up, even if it created tension, because silence would have felt like complicity. Notice the moral undertone. Speaking becomes ethical necessity. Advanced listening involves detecting moral framing. Now take a slow breath. You are now operating at very high listening density. Multiple abstract ideas, layered argument, implied hierarchy, emotional restraint, philosophical reflection, all moving at a conversational pace. If you feel mentally stretched, that's exactly where growth happens. Now we're going to bring all the elements together: speed, abstraction, emotion, persuasion, subtle power shifts, and philosophical reasoning into extended listening simulations that truly test your C1 and C2 capacity. At this level, comprehension is not only about understanding, it is about maintaining clarity under pressure. Let's begin with a dense conversational exchange that blends logic and emotion. I understand the strategic rationale behind the merger. I really do. But what concerns me is the cultural integration. You can align systems, restructure departments, even renegotiate contracts. But if values clash, friction becomes inevitable. Pause. Notice the layered structure, agreement, concern, operational factors, then cultural dimension. Now imagine another executive responding. That's a valid point, but cultural integration isn't entirely unpredictable. It depends on 1. Leadership alignment and communication transparency. Pause again. Did you detect the attempt to contain the concern? The second speaker reframes cultural friction as manageable. Advanced listening requires noticing emotional containment strategies. Now let's increase conceptual density. If we evaluate the decision purely from a financial standpoint, the numbers support it. However, long-term sustainability involves intangible factors that resist quantification, loyalty, trust, morale. Pause. The speaker introduces measurable versus immeasurable variables. At this level, conversations often move between concrete and abstract domains. You must shift with them. Now let's simulate a more personal but equally layered exchange. I'm not questioning your commitment. I'm questioning whether the current structure allows you to operate effectively. Notice how the criticism is redirected from person to structure. This is a protective rhetorical move. Advanced listeners detect an intention to preserve relationship while challenging performance. Now imagine the response. Maybe, but structures don't exist independently of people. We create them. and we sustain them. Pause. That statement shifts responsibility back to individuals. This is subtle, ideological contrast, structure versus agency. If you miss that philosophical dimension, you only hear surface disagreement. Now let's move into extended narrative with embedded persuasion. When I reflect on that period, I don't see failure, at least not in the conventional sense. What I see is experimentation, iteration, recalibration. We tend to label outcomes too quickly as success or failure, without appreciating the developmental arc in between. Pause. Did you catch the reframing of failure as process? That is persuasive storytelling. Advanced listening requires identifying narrative reframing used to influence interpretation. Now let's intensify emotional nuance again. I don't need acknowledgement. I need alignment. Short sentence, heavy meaning. The speaker is prioritizing shared direction over recognition. Now imagine someone replying softly. Alignment requires clarity, and clarity requires honesty. Layered cause and effect. Alignment to clarity to honesty. At C2 level, arguments often compress logic into brief statements. You must unpack them mentally. Now let's introduce rapid-fire intellectual exchange. We can't solve systemic issues with isolated solutions. True, but systemic reform often begins with isolated initiatives, only if those initiatives scale. And scaling requires coordination. Pause. This is conceptual ping pong. Systemic versus isolated. Reform versus scaling. Coordination as prerequisite. Advanced listening requires tracking evolving premises. Now let's challenge your stamina with an extended reflective monologue, combining abstraction and subtle irony. I used to chase clarity as though it were a destination, believing that once I understood every variable, every risk, every possible outcome, certainty would follow. But life rarely grants that luxury. In fact, the pursuit of perfect clarity often delays necessary action. So I've learned to operate within partial understanding, to move forward even when ambiguity persists, not recklessly, but consciously. Pause slowly. Notice the layered self-evolution, chasing clarity, realizing its limits, redefining action under uncertainty. Advanced listening means tracking philosophical maturation in narrative. Now let's examine subtle social signaling. As someone who's been in the industry for over 2 decades, I've seen cycles like this before. That opening establishes authority. Or consider, I'm still relatively new to this space, so I might be overlooking something. That establishes humility. Advanced listeners interpret identity positioning immediately. Now let's intensify emotional contradiction. I'm proud of what we accomplished, even if it didn't meet expectations. Pride and disappointment coexist. Or, I support the direction. I just question the pace. Agreement and critique coexisting. At C1 and C2, emotional duality is common. Now let's move into extended debate with implicit hierarchy. If the objective is efficiency, then automation is logical. But if the objective is employment stability, automation presents complications. Pause. That sentence frames objectives as mutually influential. Advanced listening requires holding competing priorities without forcing resolution. Now imagine a moderator summarizing, so the disagreement isn't about automation itself, but about which value takes precedence. Notice how the moderator clarifies the core conflict. Advanced listeners appreciate synthesis as much as argument. Now let's build endurance with a long, dense passage. In collaborative environments, misalignment rarely stems from malice. More often, it arises from unspoken assumptions, divergent interpretations of shared terminology, and mismatched or expectations about outcomes. And unless those underlying differences are surfaced explicitly, tension accumulates quietly until it manifests in ways that appear sudden, but were in fact developing gradually. Pause. Did you track the chain? Misalignment to unspoken assumptions, to divergence, to tension accumulation, to sudden manifestation. Advanced listening requires mapping invisible causality. Now let's explore rhetorical layering under time pressure. I don't have all the answers, but I do have after concerns. That sentence maintains humility while asserting relevance. Or, this isn't about blame, it's about responsibility. Blame versus responsibility. Subtle but powerful distinction. Now let's intensify philosophical tone once more. Growth demands discomfort, not because discomfort is inherently virtuous, but because transformation rarely occurs within zones of ease. The tension between familiarity and aspiration is where evolution begins. Pause slowly. Did you follow the metaphorical reasoning? Familiarity versus aspiration. Tension as catalyst. At C2 level, metaphor becomes intellectual shorthand. Now take a slow breath. You have now processed extended debate, rapid exchanges, embedded persuasion, philosophical reflection, emotional contradiction, social signaling, rhetorical reframing, and causal mapping. Your listening endurance is expanding. Now we arrive at the final stretch, where everything you have practiced comes together in one extended advanced listening simulation. This section will require full concentration, emotional sensitivity, structural awareness, and predictive reasoning. Just listen calmly and allow your mind to process in layers. Imagine you are listening to a long-form interview between a journalist and a founder of a rapidly growing company. The conversation is reflective, analytical, occasionally defensive, and at times philosophical. The journalist begins, looking back. Would you say the growth happened faster than I anticipated, or exactly as planned? The founder responds slowly, faster in terms of visibility, slower in terms of infrastructure. We gained attention almost overnight, but internally, we were still building processes, and that mismatch created tension. Pause. Did you detect the contrast? Visibility versus infrastructure, external perception versus internal readiness. Now the journalist continues. Some critics argue that rapid scaling compromised quality. How do you respond to that? Our founder takes a breath. I wouldn't dismiss that concern outright. In periods of acceleration, imperfections become more visible. But I'd also argue that growth exposes weaknesses that already existed. It doesn't create them. Pause slowly. Notice the strategic structure. Partial acknowledgement, followed by reframing. Advanced listening means hearing both concession and defense simultaneously. The journalist leans in further. So you're saying the flaws were inevitable? The founder replies, I'm saying evolution is rarely seamless. We tend to romanticize smooth expansion, but in reality, Iteration involves friction, recalibration, sometimes even temporary regression. Pause. Did you track the philosophical tone? The founder moved from specific criticism to a broader reflection on growth. Now the journalist shifts direction. Was there a moment when you questioned whether the expansion was sustainable? The founder hesitates slightly. There were moments of doubt. Yes. Particularly when expectations began to outpace capacity. When stakeholders assume momentum equals stability, pressure intensifies. Notice the phrase momentum equals stability. That's conceptual. Now the journalist challenges further. And did that pressure affect decision-making? The founder answers carefully. Pressure always affects decision-making. The question is whether it distorts judgment or sharpens it. Pause. This is high-level abstraction. Pressure as neutral variable. Nudge distortion versus sharpening. Advanced listening requires tracking conditional reasoning. Now the founder continues without interruption. There's a narrative that leaders must appear unwavering, but internally. Responsible leadership involves constant reassessment. The tension between projecting confidence and acknowledging uncertainty is one of the most difficult balances to maintain. Pause slowly. Did you detect the identity framing? Leadership redefined as reflective rather than rigid. Now, let's deepen the simulation. The journalist asks, some employees have described the environment as intense, occasionally overwhelming. Would you agree? The founder replies, intensity is subjective. For some, it signals opportunity. For others, instability. I can't control perception entirely, but I can influence transparency. Pause. Notice how the founder avoids full agreement or denial. This is emotional neutrality under scrutiny. The journalist presses further. Do you regret any decisions? The founder responds after a brief pause. Regret is a complicated word. I acknowledge miscalculations. I reflect on unintended consequences. But regret implies wishing the experience hadn't occurred, and every setback reshaped our trajectory in ways we couldn't have predicted. Pause slowly. Did you hear the semantic distinction between regret and reflection? Advanced listening requires parsing lexical precision. Now let's extend the dialogue into a broader philosophical domain. The journalist asks, what do you believe growth ultimately requires? The founder answers thoughtfully, growth requires resilience, but not stubbornness, adaptability, but not volatility, vision, but not detachment from reality. It's a continuous calibration between aspiration and limitation. Pause. Notice the parallel structure. Resilience versus stubbornness, adaptability versus volatility, vision versus detachment. This symmetrical contrast is common in advanced discourse. Now, let's raise cognitive intensity one final time. The journalist concludes, if you could advise your younger self, what would you emphasize? The founder smiles faintly. I would emphasize patience, not as passive waiting, but as strategic pacing. I'd remind myself that acceleration is seductive, but sustainability is strategic. And I'd accept sooner that clarity often emerges through action, not before it. Pause slowly. Did you follow the final conceptual layers? Patience redefined. And acceleration contrasted with sustainability, clarity emerging through action. This is the culmination of advanced listening. Now take a deep breath. Notice how many layers were present in that single extended simulation. Deflection without denial. Concession paired with reframing. Abstract reasoning under scrutiny. Identity positioning. Philosophical reflection. Emotional neutrality. Structural contrast. And you followed it, step by step, calmly, without translating. That is C1 and C2 listening, the capacity in motion. Now let's consolidate your skill with one final reflective passage to strengthen endurance. Advanced listening is not about perfection. It's about composure. When ideas accelerate, remain steady. When emotion intensifies, remain observant. When arguments layer upon one another, remain structured in your mind. Listening at this level is active interpretation, not passive reception. It is the art of hearing what is said, understanding what is implied, and recognizing what remains unspoken. Pause. You have trained prediction. You have trained inference. You have trained emotional mapping. You have trained structural tracking. You have trained abstraction tolerance. Now your final exercise is simple, but powerful. From this point forward, whenever you listen to an advanced English podcast, interview, debate, or lecture, do not focus only on vocabulary. Focus on movement. How does the speaker begin? Where do they pivot? What assumptions guide their reasoning? What emotional tone underlies their words? That awareness transforms listening into mastery. Take one last slow breath with me. You are no longer just hearing English. You are interpreting meaning in real time. And that is the essence of advanced conversational fluency. Now we are going to complete your advanced listening training with one final deep expansion, not by adding complexity for the sake of difficulty, but by strengthening integration. Because at the C1 and C2 level, the real mastery lies in integration, the ability to combine emotional awareness, structural tracking, predictive reasoning, conceptual abstraction, and composure, all at the same time, naturally. Up until now, you have practiced identifying nuance, tracking debate, hearing reframing, mapping logic, and detecting emotional undertones. Now let's integrate everything into a long, layered listening experience that mirrors the kind of content you might encounter in a high-level podcast conversation about life decisions, identity, risk, and responsibility. Imagine you are listening to someone reflecting on a pivotal career decision. For a long time, I equated stability with success. I believed that if my environment felt predictable, structured, and secure, then I was progressing. But over time, I started to notice a subtle dissatisfaction, not dramatic, not urgent, just a quiet awareness that predictability was becoming limitation. Pause slowly. Did you track the emotional tone? Calm reflection, not resentment, not crisis. Now the speaker continues. I think what unsettled me most wasn't boredom. It was the realization that I was optimizing for safety rather than growth. And while safety has its place, growth requires exposure, discomfort, sometimes even temporary disorientation. Notice the layered reasoning. Optimization for safety versus growth. Comfort, in contrasted with exposure. Advanced listening requires holding those contrasts clearly in your mind. Now the speaker shifts perspective. At first, I framed my hesitation as practicality. I told myself I was being responsible, protecting what I had built. But eventually, I had to question whether responsibility was becoming rationalization. Pause. That is subtle self-critique. The speaker reinterprets their own justification. Advanced listening requires tracking reinterpretation of prior. Belief. Now let's increase abstraction slightly. There's a difference between preserving stability and resisting evolution, and that distinction is rarely obvious in the moment. It only becomes clear in retrospect, when you look back and recognize patterns you couldn't see while living through them. Pause slowly. Did you follow the time shift? Present reflection on past limitation. Now imagine an interviewer asking, "So what ultimately changed your perspective?" The speaker responds, thoughtfully, "It wasn't a single event. It was accumulation, small signals, repeated frustrations, subtle envy when I saw others taking risks I had dismissed. And at some point, I realized the discomfort of staying was outweighing the discomfort of leaving." Pause. That sentence contains a powerful inversion. Discomfort of staying versus discomfort of leaving. Advanced listening means recognizing emotional tipping points expressed indirectly. Now the interviewer probes further. Did you fear a failure? The speaker smiles slightly. Of course, but I began to see failure differently. Not as final judgment, but as information. If something collapses, it reveals structural weaknesses, and that revelation, while uncomfortable, is useful. Pause. Did you detect reframing again? Failure redefined as information. Now let's integrate emotional nuance. People often assume risk takers are fearless, but in my experience, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of uncertainty. Pause slowly. That is philosophical density. Courage redefined through cost comparison. At C2 level, you must process conceptual reframing quickly. Now the speaker continues without interruption. What surprised me most wasn't the external challenge. It was the internal negotiation, the constant dialogue between caution and ambition, between loyalty to what I had built and curiosity about what I might build next. And that internal negotiation was far more exhausting than any external obstacle. Pause. Did you follow the emotional layering? Caution versus ambition, loyalty versus curiosity, internal negotiation versus external challenge. Now imagine the interviewer asking quietly, "And now, looking back, was it worth it?" The speaker takes a measured breath. Worth it isn't the right metric. The experience reshaped me, and that transformation carries both gains and losses. I gained perspective, adaptability, resilience, but I also lost simplicity, certainty, and some relationships that couldn't adapt alongside me. Pause slowly. Notice the emotional balance, gain and loss coexisting. Advanced listening requires accepting emotional duality without forcing resolution. Now, let's deepen the final integration. There's a narrative that growth is purely positive, but growth is disruptive. It alters identity, expectations, relationships, and sometimes the very goals you thought you were pursuing. So if I've learned anything, it's that progress should be evaluated not only by achievement, but by alignment. Alignment between action and values. Pause. That sentence integrates everything: narrative critique, disruption acknowledgement, identity shift, value alignment. This is the kind of layered reasoning advanced podcasts often contain. Now take a slow breath. Notice how you processed all of that without translation, without panic, without losing structure. You followed time shifts, identity framing, philosophical, reframing, emotional nuance, rhetorical contrast, and internal negotiation. That is advanced listening fluency. Now let's conclude your training with one final condensed conceptual passage designed to test your full integration. Mastery in listening is not about catching every word. It's about perceiving direction, sensing tone, mapping logic, and interpreting implication. It's about recognizing when agreement masks hesitation, when confidence hides uncertainty, when criticism disguises a concern, and when silence communicates more than speech. At the highest level, listening becomes anticipation. You no longer chase meaning. You move alongside it. Pause slowly. Let that settle. You have trained your ear for subtlety. You have trained your mind for structure. You have trained your emotions for neutrality. You have trained your attention for endurance. And most importantly, you have trained your confidence. Because advanced listening is not just linguistic skill, it is composure under complexity. From this point forward, when you engage with advanced English conversations, whether interviews, debates, or philosophical reflections, you will hear layers you once missed. You will sense pivots before they complete. You will anticipate conclusions before they're stated. And that awareness, that calm, predictive clarity, is what defines C1 and C2 listening competence. Now we will complete this advanced listening journey by strengthening your final layer of awareness, the ability to remain mentally present when conversations become layered with uncertainty, contradiction, and unresolved tension. Because in real high-level discussions, clarity does not always arrive neatly. Sometimes conversations end without full resolution. And your task as an advanced listener is to tolerate that ambiguity without losing comprehension. Imagine listening to two experts discussing the future of work. One says, "We can predict trends. We can analyze patterns. But ultimately, disruption rarely announces itself in advance. It emerges quietly, at the margins, before reshaping the center." Pause slowly. Did you catch the metaphor? Margins reshaping the center. Now the other expert responds, "True, but anticipating disruption requires more than observation. It requires willingness to question assumptions we've grown comfortable with." Notice the shift: observation versus questioning. Advanced listening requires detecting when the focus moves from prediction to mindset. Now the first expert continues. And yet, questioning assumptions can destabilize systems that rely on shared certainty. There's a balance between healthy skepticism and paralyzing doubt. Pause. Healthy skepticism versus paralyzing doubt. That symmetrical contrast structure should now feel familiar to you. At this level, speakers often present balanced tensions rather than fixed answers. Now let's deepen the ambiguity slightly. The second expert says, "Perhaps the real challenge isn't on predicting the future, but cultivating adaptability so that when change occurs, response is fluid rather than reactive." Pause slowly. Predicting versus cultivating. Future versus response. Advanced listening means recognizing that the conversation has moved from forecasting to internal capacity. Now imagine the discussion softens into personal reflection. I used to think expertise meant certainty, that being knowledgeable required definitive answers. But over time, I've become more comfortable saying, I don't know yet. Pause. Did you hear the subtle humility? Expertise redefined as openness rather than rigidity. Now the other expert nods. There's strength in intellectual humility. It keeps inquiry alive. It prevents stagnation. And it encourages dialogue rather than defensiveness. Notice the progression. Humility to inquiry to dialogue. Logical flow embedded in short statements. Now let's introduce subtle unresolved tension. The first expert says quietly, still. Uncertainty unsettles people, and leaders are often expected to project confidence, even when confidence is incomplete. Pause slowly. Projection versus internal reality. Now the second responds. Perhaps confidence isn't about certainty, but about steadiness, the ability to remain composed while navigating ambiguity. Pause. Confidence redefined again. This is layered conceptual negotiation. Now imagine the conversation gradually slows. So maybe the future isn't something we conquer, but why? Something we adapt to. Short exchange, heavy meaning. Advanced listening means sensing when dialogue becomes distilled. Now let's integrate emotional nuance one final time. I don't think the goal is to eliminate uncertainty. I think it's to build resilience within it. Pause slowly. Eliminate versus build within. Contrast structure. Now imagine the other voice responds gently. That requires trust. Trust in systems, in teams, and in oneself. Notice how responsibility shifts from abstract system to individual confidence. Advanced listening means mapping movement from external to internal focus. Now let's conclude with one final reflective monologue designed to test your composure under conceptual density. There's a tendency to search for definitive frameworks, step-by-step guides, guaranteed formulas, because clarity feels reassuring. But real complexity resists simplification. It demands patience, layered analysis, and the humility to revise interpretation as new information. Emerges. Listening at this level mirrors that complexity. It is not about capturing static meaning, but about moving with evolving context, adjusting interpretation as tone shifts, as perspective broadens, as nuance surfaces. The advanced listener does not cling to first impressions, nor rush toward premature conclusions. Instead, they remain attentive, flexible, and curious, allowing meaning to unfold fully before responding. Pause slowly. Let that settle in your mind. You have practiced hearing beneath politeness, recognizing reframing, mapping logic, interpreting hesitation, tracking abstraction, and tolerating ambiguity. You have trained yourself to remain calm during rapid exchange, steady during emotional tension, and focused during philosophical density. Advanced listening is composure under complexity, and composure can always be strengthened through deliberate practice. Thank you so much for staying with me all the way through this advanced listening session. I truly appreciate the time, focus, and mental energy you invested today, because reaching a C1 or C2 level is not about shortcuts. It's about consistent, intentional practice, just like this. What you did in this lesson was not passive listening. You trained your brain to track nuance, to hear implied meaning, to detect emotional undertones, to follow abstract reasoning, and to remain calm under complexity. And that kind of training compounds over time. The more you practice listening with awareness, the more natural it becomes. Remember, advanced listening is not about understanding every single word perfectly. It's about perceiving direction, sensing shifts in tone, recognizing structure, and interpreting intention. When you listen to English from now on, whether it's a podcast, an interview, or a professional discussion, slow your mind, stay present, and listen for layers, not just language. If this session challenged you a little, that's a very good sign. Growth happens at the edge of wine à comfort, and every time you stretch your comprehension, you expand your fluency. Keep practicing. Keep exposing yourself to complex conversations, and most importantly, keep trusting your ability to improve. I'll see you in the next advanced English listening session.